All right, let's talk about a man who was basically a Renaissance prince born into Europe's most powerful banking family, who then became Pope. We're talking about Giovanni de Medici, or as history knows him, Pope Leo X. And believe me, this guy is a fascinating bundle of contradictions. And this quote, it just hits the nail on the head. It's the whole puzzle of his legacy, right? How could one man, celebrated for creating this golden age of art, also be the guy who lit the fuse on the bomb that blew up Western Christianity? That's the big question we're going to unpack. So you really have to see him as two different people in one. On one hand, you've got this incredible patron of the arts, the guy who's funding Raphael and turning Rome into the cultural capital of the world. But on the other hand, he's the Pope on watch when the entire Protestant Reformation just explodes. I mean, it is an incredible, stark contrast. And these two images just perfectly capture this collision of worlds. You look to Germany and you see this fire of religious rebellion, literally, with Martin Luther burning the Pope's official decree in public. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Leo is living in this bubble of high Renaissance splendor, all classical beauty and art. He was in one world and seemed completely unaware of the massive storm that was gathering just over the horizon. You know, to really get a handle on Leo's actions as Pope, you have to rewind, because his entire life before he got the top job was basically a crash course in Medici-style ambition and power politics. He was groomed to be a ruler, not necessarily a holy man. I mean, just look at this career path. He's officially marked for the church at age 7. He's made a cardinal at 13. Think about that. This wasn't some deep spiritual calling. This was a strategic move, a career path engineered by his very powerful father, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was on the fast track to power before he was even old enough to really choose it. His entire worldview, his mental operating system, was programmed in the very worldly, humanistic court of Florence. He's learning from the greatest minds of the day, he's surrounded by jaw-dropping art, and he's taught, above all else, that the #1 goal is to advance the power and influence of the Medici family. So that's what's in his head: politics, culture, and dynasty. So what happens when this Renaissance prince finally gets the ultimate promotion? Well, he's famously quoted as saying, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Now, whether he said those exact words, who knows, but his entire reign really screamed that same sentiment. And here's the bottom line. His priorities were the priorities of a king, not a priest. He was launching wars, like the super expensive War of Urbino, all to make his nephew a duke. He was playing these complicated political games, jumping between alliances, always with an eye on protecting Medici interests. Spiritual leadership? That often felt like an afterthought. And boy, enjoying the papacy was expensive. That war cost a fortune. The art he commissioned was incredible, but it came with a hefty price tag. Rebuilding St. Peter's was a massive undertaking. And then there was the personal stuff, a court crawling with entertainers, exotic pets like panthers, and his famous pet white elephant, Hanno. To foot the bill for all this, he sold off church positions and borrowed staggering amounts of money, basically driving the papacy right off a financial cliff. 400,000 ducats. Just let that number sink in. That's the insane amount of debt the papacy was in when he died. In fact, within just 2 years of being elected, he had already burned through all the savings his predecessor had left behind and put the church deep in the red. Okay, so this desperate need for money is what sets the stage for the defining showdown of his time. Because way up in Germany, this quiet monk named Martin Luther is starting to have some pretty big problems with the spiritual state of the church. And his ideas, they were on a direct collision course with Leo's empty bank account. The quick fix for the debt crisis seemed obvious at the time: sell more indulgences. The basic idea was that you could make a donation to the church and in return, you'd get less time in purgatory for you or your dead relatives. And wouldn't you know it, that money went straight to projects like St. Peter's. But to a lot of people, especially in Germany, it looked an awful lot like the church was selling salvation for cash. And what's wild is how quickly this whole thing spiraled out of control. When Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517, Leo's reaction is, well, he just dismisses it. He reportedly calls it a squabble among monks, totally missing the deep public anger Luther was tapping into. By the time Leo finally gets serious and issues a papal bull condemning him, it's way too late. Luther is now the leader of a movement, and when he burns that bull in public, it's a total act of rebellion. The final excommunication in 1521, it wasn't the end of the fight, it was the official start of the split. And at the end of the day, Leo did what he was trained to do. He responded like a prince. He didn't see a theologian with real questions about faith. He saw a rebel who was challenging his power, and maybe more importantly, his income. He brought a political solution to a spiritual crisis. So the great irony is that the legacy of this incredible patron of the arts isn't really one of beauty and unity. It's one of division. His actions, all driven by his princely upbringing, accidentally triggered a revolution that would change the map of Europe forever. And this is what it all snowballed into. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just some academic debate. It was a seismic shift. It challenged 1,000 years of church authority, it split kingdoms apart, and it led to whole new ways of being Christian. And Pope Leo X was right there at the epicenter. This chart just lays it all out so clearly. On the one hand, his legacy as a patron of the arts, off the charts, an absolute high point. But when it came to spiritual leadership, at the very moment it was needed most, it was a complete and utter disaster. Ultimately, it's a tragic irony. The very things that made him the perfect Medici prince, his taste, his political savvy, his love for all things grand and beautiful, were the very things that made him blind. He was the perfect man to oversee the Renaissance, but maybe the worst possible man to face the biggest spiritual crisis in centuries. So that leaves us with this final, really interesting question to think about. Was he simply a bad pope who failed at his job? Or was he a more tragic figure, a man whose greatest talents were just completely mismatched for the historical moment he found himself in? It's a debate that really gets to the heart of his complicated, world-changing legacy.